Can you hear me okay? Yes. Good. Well, some years ago, I worked for the BBC, initially as an electronics engineer, which sounded glamorous until they told me it was in the maintenance department, which didn't sound quite so exotic. That's where I started. You can get the feel for the era that I worked there, in that this was high technology and the absolute latest when I was working there, and we were using these things. And I would be sat sometimes in my workshop at my workbench, trying to look busy, oscilloscope on, that kind of thing. And somebody would walk in and say, I can remember a particular incident, actually. One of the editors walked in and said, I've got to tell you, something terrible has happened. I've spilled my cup of coffee into the keyboard of my edit controller, and it's broken. Can you do anything about it? This would happen quite regularly, but one particular, he looked so forlorn, this chap. It particularly struck in my mind. And what I would usually say on these occasions is, what was it that you spilt into it? And it would invariably be a cup of coffee. And then the second question I would ask was, did it have sugar in it? Because if you spilt the cup of coffee with sugar in, you know you only almost have minutes before the sugar would start oozing its way through the circuit boards, and it would just ruin equipment. Ironically, if they had it looks like the classic combination, doesn't it? A table with a computer and a cup of coffee next to it. It's like the perfect work environment. Computer, refreshing cup of coffee, but actually it's a computer with its nemesis sat next to it. But if the editor if he'd been drinking something that would have been truly refreshing, we're now learning about the benefits of not drinking coffee. Just drink water. And in fact, when he passed me this keyboard, the first thing I did was go into the toilets, run all the water into the sink, and chuck this thing into some clean, fresh water and let it wash away all the gunk. It was unplugged at that point, thank you, yes. The lead wasn't long enough, fortunately, for me to make that mistake. Yes, it's interesting that if it was too long, then this computer would have to be rebuilt from scratch, really. New hard disk and everything. So what was meant to refresh the person had caused a rebuild of the computer. I've no idea why I told you that. No, there is a relevance, irrelevance to that anecdote. Last week, Robert was speaking to us, if you remember, from John chapter 3 and the story of Nicodemus. And this week we're going to look at the next chapter, chapter 4, and the story of what we often call the woman at the well, the woman from Cana. And it doesn't seem to be by accident that these two stories are side by side in the Bible. And so I am going to talk about a little bit about Nicodemus as well, because I think these two characters are so contrasting in many ways, and yet they both have such need of Jesus, but his approach to them is so different. So if you missed Robert's talk last week, then you can catch it online on YouTube. So that might help to fill in some of the gaps in my talk today. But now, at last, Caroline gets her moment. Thank you. You get a break from me, and Caroline's going to bring us that reading. Relocate this.
Okay. Yeah. I have to say that I am that person who tipped a cup of coffee over my NHS laptop, and when you said that, I could still feel that feeling of dread. The saving grace was I don't have sugar, but hey, I think they had to rebuild my laptop. Okay, so the reading is from John 4. Jesus talks with a Samaritan woman. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say that you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman, but no one asked, "What do you want?" or why are you talking with her?" Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I've ever done. Could this be the Messiah?" They came out of the town and made their way towards him.
Thanks, Caroline. That's brilliant. Excuse me. So, in chapters 3 and 4 of John, Jesus encounters 2 very different people, and he loves them both. But the way his message to each of them and the way he delivers it is very different. And as we read the Bible, we are asking ourselves what God has to say through it. We might ask, Lord, who do I identify with most here? Since I feel more challenged by what Jesus is saying to this person rather than this person. And that's okay. We don't have to identify with every story in the Bible equally at all times, just as Jesus had a different message and emphasis for these 2 different people. At different times, the Bible speaks to us in different ways. And that's why it's so important to read the Bible prayerfully, asking God's Spirit to bring it to life for us as we pray, and convict us and challenge us in that moment. And we can be praying, how are you speaking to me through this as I read it? this Samaritan woman is a complete outsider in so many ways. It's interesting that Nicodemus is named. He's called Nicodemus. This lady is not even given a name, even in this biblical account. We just know that she was a Samaritan. So I had to dig a little bit into what was going on between the Jews and the Samaritans. And what had happened was that, the Jews were exiled from Canaan, but not all of them. Some of them stayed behind, and they would intermarry with the Canaanites, and they had also then adopted some of the religious practices of the Canaanites and sort of incorporated them, merged them in with their Jewish practices. So the Jews would have seen them as being heretics, basically. And as you know, I'm sure that even today, the Jewish nation sees it very important to preserve their separateness, their uniqueness. And so this is absolutely abominable in their eyes that this had been done. And so they separated themselves and would not associate with what they saw as the heresies of the Canaanites. So she was part of this heretical group in their eyes. She was also, if that weren't bad enough, she also had the temerity to be a woman. And of course, in those days, the term patriarchy is bandied around a lot, maybe all too much at the moment, but this was an actual patriarchy that they were living in. And so women were very much second-class citizens, and it would not be expected if you, for a Jewish man to speak to a Jewish woman that he didn't know in public. It was just not on. So she was from a heretical sect, if you like. She was a woman, and all the more so, she was a woman of ill repute. As we discover, she was living outside of the moral code, even of her Canaanite community. So she was rejected. She was not only part of a community who had been rejected by the Jewish nation, but even within her own community, she was an outsider, a reject. So even in opening his mouth to speak to her, Jesus was breaking through, crashing through so many boundaries just in speaking to her. So no wonder she's so surprised when he speaks to her. So as we think about how Jesus dealt with this lady and compare it with Nicodemus, we can see his approach is massively different, and as is his challenge to each of them. And it's a reflection of Jesus' knowledge of them as individuals and his personal care for them. Let's flick across to Nicodemus for a while. So he was, by contrast, at the top of the tree as far as he and his fellow Jews were concerned. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was it was effectively a judge. He would have been prosperous, devout, upstanding, and of course, a man. So he seemed to have everything at that time. So why then does Jesus say he needs to be born again in order to get life with God? It's as if Jesus is saying to him, you think that you're nearly there, you think you're so close to the kingdom, but in fact what you need is a complete rebuild. My clicker's not working today, but John's going to... Yeah, has anyone been in this position before? It's a bit like this machine here. You thought you were so close, you rebooted, just try reboot, you try that 96 times and you realise, oh no, I need to start from scratch. This is what Jesus is saying to Nicodemus. Before lockdown, many of us, I think, thought that we were pretty much there when it came to church and faith. We had a good church community around us. We were involved in loads of ministries as a church here. Maybe on the worship team, on the speaking team, parent and toddler, apricot. We had a good pattern going of regular meetings and worship. As good as it gets, eh? Then along came COVID and smashed all that down. All the landmarks that signified a normal Christian life were swept away. Loved ones were dying of this mystery disease. People who'd grown up and spent their whole lives in church started reassessing their faith and drifting away. Uncertain about what it meant to be a Christian anymore, or what use it was. A number of high-profile Christians either got embroiled in scandals or stepped down and away from their faith for various reasons. My observation is that the people hit hardest by this were the Christian leaders, because they were so invested in the old structures. They'd even been trained in them. But much of what they thought were fundamentals of faith, it turned out, were in fact just the trappings of faith and the mechanisms of church. And the fundamentals, that personal journey, the daily walk, the dependence on the Spirit, had perhaps become sidelined. Around this time, a word started being bandied around and applied to people going through this process. The word is deconstruction. I don't know if you've come across that in this context. But if you look on the internet, it's everywhere in terms of Christian faith at the moment. Now, for some, this was a one-way journey. The deconstruction effectively led to an abandonment of faith. Or for a number of people I've known, an attachment to a new religion, although they wouldn't call it that. Things like veganism, environmentalism, radical feminism, LGBTQ plus activism. All of these things have many good aspects to teach us and challenge us about. But when they become our new religion, they just aren't sufficient, and they ring hollow after a while. Others are still in limbo, deconstructed and nowhere to go, made cynical perhaps of all truth, and maybe that makes them vulnerable to all the winds of thought and radicalism that blow across the internet. For some of us, the process of deconstruction has led to a form of reconstruction. And as you might guess, I would probably put myself in that place. As we consider what an authentic faith looks like in this new post-COVID world. We've looked at the alternatives, and we've seen that no hope lies there. It's like Jesus' disciple. We've said, where else will I go? So we take tentative steps forward, seeking to rebuild our faith with Jesus as the foundation, not our programs or our position or busyness. And maybe exploring different ways of engaging with God from what we've taken as the norm before. maybe recognising the wonder of creation, exploring old practices, pilgrimage, fasting, other biblical practices to reconnect. For me, what part of this has looked like that nature thing, realising the wonder in creation and God speaking through creation. And so it's probably also late middle age, but taking up gardening. So, in fact, yesterday, as I was preparing for this talk and thinking and praying about it, I was squeezing grapes from our grapevine that I planted in the middle of the COVID epidemic and is now yielding a crop. And last year we had our first batch of Chateau Bankside 2022, and there may be a little bit more. But as I was tasting it yesterday, I was thinking, this is too good to go into my rubbish wine. So I've actually squeezed some for the communion juice this morning. There's a picture, I think, of that's the harvest, and that's my homemade grape wine press. So we've been exploring new ways of engaging with God, new ways of being church, perhaps, new ways of leadership. But if we ever wanted to see a living example of what it looks like to seem so close to the kingdom and yet actually need to be entirely reborn, COVID has given us that. We just need to look at what God has done to the church worldwide and see how God has said, no, you need a rebuild. And that's what we're doing at the moment. So I say that partly by way of confession, I suppose, but also to say, value your prayers, I always do, but also that connects with you. You know, I'd be very happy to talk to you if that's also where you're at. Let's go back to the Samaritan woman now. I hadn't intended to spend that long on Nicodemus and that side of it, but I felt it was right this morning. Going back to the Samaritan woman, Jesus doesn't mention being born again to her, interestingly. Instead, he talks of living water. This lady, she was on the edge of everything. The desert, her religion, her community. It's as if everything had shriveled down to almost nothing. And here comes Jesus, breaking boundaries, even in speaking to her. And initially, their conversation is around that mundane issue of just the water in the well. Jesus talks about this strange idea of water that means you won't thirst again. And she doesn't really get it. Remember, she's saying, well, that means I don't have to come to the well again. But then everything changes when he tells her about her previous husbands and her current man who isn't her husband. And she realises that she's not just in the presence of a thirsty man or a wise man, but actually this is a spiritual moment. This is prophecy. God is speaking into this moment and reaching me. Even though those words, there's nothing spiritual per se in the words, it's prophetic statement. Just a few straightforward words, but what a transformation they brought for her. And what a difference it can make today when we know that God is moving in the here and now, and he's not just an abstract idea. I've seen this on a number of occasions where something that perhaps seems like a normal service, suddenly God breaks in and everything is transformed. I was thinking of an experience I had at New Wine where one of the young leaders came forward for prayer, and I was talking to him, and he said he was struggling because his grandmother had died and caused all sorts of questions and issues. And while I was praying, I said, this song, this hymn comes to mind as I pray about you and your grandmother. And it was the very hymn that had been used in her funeral the previous week, a couple of weeks beforehand. And it was just the knowledge that God was there. He was just a changed person because it was that knowledge that God was meeting with him. He was in his grieving with him, and it changed everything for him. So, for this lady, all those words about her husbands, they weren't just a party trick. They meant that Jesus really knew her and knew the things that she was ashamed of as well, and yet wasn't judging her, was not rejecting her. There's a lot of science and pseudoscience around the word shame at the moment. But one thing I can be pretty confident about is that we've all experienced it, and perhaps are experiencing it. Time is short, but I'm going to give you a little glimpse into one of my sources of shame in my life. It's my shed. If you've ever been in the garden, apart from Darren, nobody will have been invited into my shed because I'm so ashamed of it. It's a complete mess. And I have another 3 just like it. And okay, I'm embarrassed that it's a mess, but it's also what it represents, because it represents me being so busy in my sort of ADHD way, rushing around for the last 30 years, doing things that I thought were more exciting than actually looking after my house and the things that I had to care for. Even more so, I can't believe I'm showing you this. Even more so, it represents all the stuff that I have. And I realise, I'm starting to recognise that I use stuff as a protection against the future. Some people use power or wealth. For me, I think I can stop something bad happening to me by accumulating more things. Not flash things that, tools and other things that can somehow protect me in emergency. And of course that's a ridiculous thing, but it's there in the back of my mind. So that is a source of my shame. There are other things that I'm even more ashamed of. The people I've hurt with my words and actions. The times I should have acted, but I didn't. So Jesus knew this woman's own shame and the shame imposed on her by the community around her. But he still loved her and he offered her this living water. And he knows you and the things that bring you shame. They may have been things that you've done yourself and that you judge yourself for, or they may be things that others have imposed upon you. And he offers you the chance to lay that down before the cross, because he died to take our guilt and shame. He says to the woman at the well, you think you're 1,000,000 miles away, dried up and nearly dead, but you just need to be refreshed by my living water. Let the living water wash the guilt and shame away. And he says that to us too. We get offered loads of ways to fix ourselves nowadays, don't we? Retail therapy, sports, hydrotherapy, you name it. But all these things, they work from the outside in. And that's why they don't really work. But the living water that Jesus is talking about, it works from the inside out. Have you ever had that experience of when you've been maybe exercising on a really hot day and you drink a cup of ice cold water and you can just feel it, can't you, kind of doing its work within you, rehydrating you. And that's what this living water does. It brings real hope, restoration and forgiveness. Is that what you need most this morning? I had a sense that there may be people here who need that freedom from shame. So, can we have the slide of the two together, John? We're going back to this idea of looking at the scripture and asking God to let it speak to us. How is it speaking to me this morning? Do I need refreshing, or do I need a complete rebuild? Maybe a bit of both. Or maybe something else. Let's ask God as we approach communion to speak to us. Who do I most resemble in these chapters from John? Am I like Nicodemus, seemingly all sorted, but actually needing that complete reset? Deconstruction and reconstruction. If so, maybe today is the day where I say, here I am, God. Take my life, do what you want with me, rebuild me, let me be born again in you. Or maybe you feel more like the Samaritan woman, far from the centre, not in the in crowd, far from God, parched, desperate for that living water. Maybe God's saying something else to you. Let's take a few moments. We're going to go into communion in a few moments. And we'll have a chance. There'll be a little bit more worship afterwards than we usually have. Also a chance for you to reflect and pray. Pray with one another if you'd like to. Let's take a couple of moments before we take communion. We read in the story of the woman at the well, Jesus saying, I'm thirsty, I thirst. There was another time where Jesus said, I thirst, and that was when he was on the cross. And what he drank wasn't pure fresh water, but wine vinegar. The one who came to bring us the water of life, gasping for a drink on the cross, dying for us. That was the sacrifice he made so that we could be restored to relationship with God. So, as we approach the cross, let's acknowledge that he knows us through and through. He knows the parts of our life where we need challenging and rebuilding. He knows where we're holding shame. As I said, I want particularly one that if there are those here for whom shame has a powerful hold over you, and God wants to release you from that this morning. Or are you longing to drink the water of life and be refreshed from the inside out? Just spend some moments now asking the Lord to reveal these areas to you.